Over the course of 2023, I played a game called Gundam Evolution, a PvP team-based mech shooter. It was my favorite game of last year, and maybe one of my favorite games of all time. Unfortunately, on November 30th, the official Gundam Evolution servers went offline forever. I was pretty heartbroken when I first heard about it, especially during a summer when everything seemed to be going wrong with my life. But I had a lot of fun, and I met a lot of great people along the way.
Huge, Ender,
Let's
huge!
go!
A few months ago, some of those friends started talking about this new up-and-coming mech shooter, Mecha BREAK. And I'll be honest, my first impression of some of the videos was kind of lukewarm, but since a lot of GeVo players that I know were seemingly excited for it, I decided to give it a go and I signed up for the closed beta. And just like so many movie trailers that come out, my first impression was blown away at just how fun and fast-paced the game actually was. And while not a direct replacement, I'm hoping that when the game finally comes out, that Mecha BREAK will fill in the gap left behind by GeVo's passing. So, as a former GeVo player, I thought it would be fun to compare the two mech shooters. There are definitely some similarities between the two, while, at the same time, a lot of things that make both games stand out from one another. Please note that I will not be saying one game is better than the other, because, frankly, that is unfair to both games, especially since Mecha BREAK is still in active development. Both games are great in their own regard, and are different enough that I believe they could have coexisted with one another. There are plenty of other first-person shooter games and hero shooters that exist at the same time, and everyone has their own preferences. And some players may even play multiple FPS games at once. Before I get into the actual gameplay, we should cover the cosmetics customization inside the games. Both games provide various ways to customize the suits that you pilot. GeVo even goes so far as to add different unit selection animations, MVP animations, emotes, and even different stamps your individual suits can use. However, the actual unit customization was lacking, as while some suits had a lot of options to choose from, some of the options were either boring or just ugly. Plus, the customizations were actually very limited in a sense you could only choose a unit and weapon skin, and not make any real detailed changes. This was problematic as some combinations just didn't look good, or some skins or guns just didn't have an equivalent skin or gun to go with it. Mecha BREAK, on the other hand, has a much more detailed customization for not only the different suits, but even your pilot. While the suits have default color schemes, you can unlock various color palettes and go into a lot of detail on how you want your suits to look. The main limitations are which colors they have unlocked, and from what I noticed, some of the rarer colors would only be available to one suit that you assign it to. But there's also the pilot customization. You can choose different genders, height, weight, dimensions, eye and hair color, and much more. And I'm pretty sure players who are more artistic than I am could possibly create characters that resemble themselves or anyone out in the real world. While there are some limitations, I'm not going to complain about a system that provides a very detailed character customization. Plus, the majority of the pilot customization is free, with only outfits requiring unlocks or purchases. But that's just the gravy. A lack of gravy didn't hurt GeVo. Lots of other things did. And the excess, sweet, delicious Mecha BREAK gravy won't save it from being a lackluster game, which it definitely isn't. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of both games. I'm separating the core concepts of both games into three categories: gameplay, units, and game modes. A lot of the core gameplay mechanics for both games are the same, but they are implemented differently. Both games utilize some sort of boost gauge system. Since there is a difference of scale of the maps between the two games, the size of the gauge also differs. By a lot. Comparatively speaking, GeVo has much smaller maps and thus much smaller boosts. Each suit has a different number of dashes, 1, 2, or 3, based on design choices for the suits, and I'm not including G-dashing. The boost also allows each suit to float in the air for a short time, but doesn't allow the unit to actually take flight. These were all gameplay decisions for the game and made sense for the map layout, size, and objectives. Mecha BREAK has a huge boost system to match its massive maps. This isn't to say the strikers are necessarily larger than the Gundam's mobile suits, as you can see in the literal small details on GeVo maps, but that the battlefields are just that much larger. Not only can each suit utilize multiple, if not dozens of dashes on one gauge, but each suit can take flight and boost through the air, even if some suits do that better than others. This adds a new dimension in the combat that just wouldn't work on smaller maps. Because of the larger boost gauge, the melee suits require available boosts to use their melee attacks. While Mecha BREAK doesn't actually show health numbers for your unit, there is a big difference between the games with regards to passive health regen. In GeVo, if you are out of combat for a certain period of time, your health starts to slowly regenerate back to maximum. There are also health packs scattered around the maps that return health to the unit. Mecha BREAK doesn't have health regen. While each suit does have armor that slowly regenerates out of combat, if you take health damage, it sticks. And since some attacks ignore armor, you have to start playing more and more carefully to avoid getting killed. There are some maps that include health packs, but they are very few and far between. Both games require unique suits per team. This means that no two players on the same team can play the same unit. No two Ashimars on a team, no two Falcons. But neither game is like most MOBAs that I know of. Each team can run the exact same 6 units if they wanted to. But there is a difference between when you can select the units. Since GeVo is, usually, played over multiple rounds, you can switch units in between them. You can even switch off units during the round. This allowed a lot of flexibility. If your team realizes something isn't working, players can switch suits to try a different strategy. This also allowed players to play around G maneuvers, which I'll explain in a moment, where a player may switch off a suit after using it, or switch during overtime to utilize the starting 50% G maneuver gauge better. Mecha BREAK doesn't allow that, and that's because most maps are just one round. This means that suit selection at the start is a lot more important, as you will have to adapt your team strategies without changing your team composition. Didn't bring a unit that can provide healing? You have to be more conservative in your attacks. The enemy team has more air units than yours? Your team will have to adjust to deal with the lack of air superiority. But since most matches are just a single round, it's not a huge deal. And if there's going to be a competitive scene in the future, teams will have to take that into account. Gundam Evolution does have one mechanic that Mecha BREAK lacks, and that's the G maneuver. I believe this is for the best because while G maneuvers were exciting, splashy, and provided some well-timed attacks, it definitely caused some issues with balancing. For example, the turn A probably had the best G maneuver in the game. A well-timed butterfly could just devastate the entire team with ease. But the problem lay with the other abilities. It didn't quite have the same range or damage as the snipers, and, besides its self-heal, the only other ability was to grab and stun units at close range. And while definitely not a bad ability, it didn't allow a lot of well-timed team attacks. It definitely struggled on maps that didn't quite have a whole lot of space to work with, and was extremely powerful on more open maps. Another example is the Ashimar. Months into the game, Ashimar got a very good buff and damage for its AoE ability. The problem is that it indirectly buffed its G maneuver by allowing even decent players to easily get 3 to 4 G maneuvers per round, when most suits usually got 2. The G maneuver later had to get nerfed so that a decent player would more than likely only get 2 per round. So, a lack of an ultimate ability in Mecha BREAK is probably for the best, as that's one less balanced issue for the developers to work with. There is also a big difference in how the units aim. In GeVo, like most first-person shooters, the majority of suits reward players that have good aim skills. Flicking was also a very important skill to have. This was always my problem in GeVo, as my aim has always been decent. Mecha BREAK, for the most part, ignores that. This is because it is a third-person action shooter instead of a first-person shooter. Every suit, including the melee units, have the ability to lock onto targets. And honestly, this makes sense since the battlefields are much larger and the units have better mobility over longer periods of time with how large the boost gauges are. Good aim and flicking skills can still matter in some cases, as there are occasionally environmental effects that prevent lock-ons. Mecha BREAK doesn't allow players to resurrect their teammates. In GeVo, there's a short period of time, well, most of the time, where a team member can repair their teammate. But after a few seconds or if the unit receives even more damage, the unit is completely destroyed. This itself isn't that big of an issue in Mecha BREAK, but one of my biggest issues with Mecha BREAK is how long it takes to respawn. The issue is not how long the respawn timer is, it's the before and the after. After going down in GeVo, the 10-second timer immediately starts, sometimes 13 seconds for some reason, even though your teammates have a few seconds to try and res you. When you do respawn, you can immediately leave the spawn point and head to the objective. This does take some time and is only a problem on defense, explained later, but is a design choice. This only adds maybe a 20 to 25 seconds depending on the map. In Mecha BREAK, it's a 20-second respawn timer, but it doesn't start immediately. There's a 2 to 3 second delay before the timer starts, an additional 5-second delay after it ends for admittedly cool animation, another about 5 seconds before you can exit the initial stealth or travel mode to rejoin the fight, and on some maps, another 5 seconds before you can even reach the battleground. So it sounds like a 20-second timer, but in reality it's a minimum 32-second timer at best. The units from both games can be mostly separated into 4 categories: close range, mid-range, aerial, and long-range units. While Gundam Evolution ended its run with 24 suits to choose from, it only officially started with 12 units, but had an additional 5 units to unlock at release and 7 more that were released over the course of the game's lifetime. Of course, when GeVo first came out, there was some disagreement between the players on whether certain suits were pay to win, since GeVo was a free-to-play game with microtransactions in it. Mecha BREAK, at least in the beta test, has 11 suits, with only 1 unlocked right at the start. This doesn't seem too bad, as most of the units I saw were fairly cheap, with the free in-game currency that you earn after games, but I hope this changes closer to release, as some of the units had a very high cost. It wasn't that big of a deal during the beta, as I noticed after hours of playing the game that they gave us free currency to unlock everything with. I won't knock the smaller striker selection, as each suit needed to be completely designed from the ground up. Gundam Evolution at least had the advantage with the 45-year-old IP, where they really just had to decide which abilities and weapons each suit was limited to. The close-range suits for both games consist of mostly melee units. Each suit has ways to close the gap to reach enemy units, and most suits have some range capabilities as well. Because of the difference in map sizes, the Mecha BREAK melee attacks also boost the unit towards their target as part of the attack, which consumes some of the boost gauge. GeVo does have a few non-melee close-range suits like the Sasabi, which asks you questions that you'd rather not answer. The aerial units are another example of the difference between both games. These units from both games have a transform mode that allows them to fly and play differently than the other suits. But the GeVo suits only stay transformed for a specific short period of time. When that time ends, the unit transforms back and has to use its boost to stay in the air. The Mecha BREAK suits can stay transformed for as long as they have boost, which, as mentioned before, lasts a long time and doesn't have a cooldown. Both game suits do have short periods of time where the aerial units can't transform, but once that's over they can fly back up to start harassing again. In the case of the Mecha BREAK suits, the wait is mostly if you need more boost gauge. The long-range units are your typical sniper units. Both games have 2, with the GM Sniper from GeVo being the more standard one-shot, one-kill type unit, where a headshot took out most units in one hit. The Dynamis usually needed 2 headshots, but had a little more flexibility by switching to mid-range, and also having a better G-maneuver. Both Mecha BREAK snipers can't get headshots, like all of the units, and usually requires 3 or more hits to take out a unit. But both make up for it by having lock-ons and additional abilities. The Narukami can stealth, while the Aquila can fly up and snipe from the air. The mid-range units encompass all of the remaining units, including the GeVo aerial units, as when on the ground they have the same range as the other units. I would also put the units with healing abilities in this category. They all have various abilities and damage outputs that give each suit advantages and disadvantages. I've talked about a lot of differences between the two games, but the game modes are almost completely different. The only similarities are the 6v6 gameplay. And that's pretty much it. And even then, it's mostly differences.
GeVo has 4 types of maps: point capture, destruction, domination, and, well, we won't talk about Buried City. Each mode has various different maps, allowing for different strategies, approaches, and choke points. One of the downfalls is that you can't choose which game mode to play, except for custom matches, so both casual and ranked queues give you a game mode and map at random. Point capture maps have 2 points on the map for one team to try and capture, and each team gets 1 round to try and capture both points. The defending team has a more difficult time defending the first point, as they only ever get 1 spawn point, which is much further away from the first point than the attacker's spawn point. It's the opposite for the second point. While the attacking team does get a second spawn point that is past the first, the defense's spawn point is usually right next to the second point. The team with the greatest percentage of point captures, or most point captures, wins. If both teams capture both points, then overtime rounds are determined by a couple of factors, which I won't get into, and basically keeps going until someone wins or it's a draw. A draw only happens after 4 overtime rounds, or if neither team captures both points, but has the same capture percentage.
Destruction maps are mostly similar to point capture. There are closer defensive spawn points, the attacking team can capture a closer spawn point, and a bomb has to be armed or disarmed. The same overtime rules apply to destruction maps. Domination maps are more like classic domination games. Each map has 3 capture points on it. Every 90 seconds, one of the points is available for 60 seconds to be captured and given points to the controlling team. After a maximum of 4 capture points, the team with the most percentage wins the round. There's a maximum of 3 rounds, and there are no tiebreaker rounds. Oh, and there is no Buried City in Gundam Evolution. Mecha BREAK has 3 different game modes: 6v6, 3v3, and something called Mech. Unlike GeVo, you get to pick the game mode, but the maps are random. For 6v6 teamfights, each map has its own unique objective. Each map has a time limit, and the team that reaches the goal objective first, or has the most points at the end of the match, wins. Oh, and these maps are massive. Prob Sinkhole is similar to GeVo's domination maps, where there are 3 capture points. However, each capture point is available at the same time, after a short delay, and both teams can fight for control of all 3 at once. Mercury Shipyards has a payload objective, but each team is running their transport at the same time. The transports go faster if players are on their team's platform, and transports reverse if they are on the enemy team's platform. There are also some points to fight over to give a temporary boost to transports. Eye of Mishra requires keys to be uploaded to a rocket. The keys spawn in 3 different locations, and the mode is kind of like Capture the Flag. A player can grab a key and run it to the rocket. If they are killed along the way, the key is destroyed. Each team does get supplemental points for killing players on the other team, but the keys are worth the most points. Cape Blanc Observatory has a very lore-specific objective. You need to destroy the most Shatterers before the enemy team. The Shatterers spawn at changing points on the map. Graceland Sky City is more of a classic team deathmatch. There are 3 rounds, and each round is played on a different area of the map. Each player has 1 life per round, so may the best team win. I didn't get a chance to play a lot of 3v3, as I was more interested in trying out the different mechs, and to me it felt like 6v6 was the better place to do this. However, the 3v3 mode does have different maps, and is more like a lot of other first-person shooters where the team that reaches the most unit kills wins. And it fits for smaller squads. The one map I did play on was a lot smaller than the 6v6 maps, which made a lot of sense for the more direct team fights. Oh, and Mech? GeVo has no equivalent. Period. This is where you get I was honestly very surprised at just how much I enjoyed playing in the Mecha BREAK beta as much as I did. I couldn't play during the entire weekend due to real-life issues, but after playing the first day, I was looking forward to playing on the 3rd and 4th days. There are some issues with balancing and unlocks, but I believe those can be ironed out before the official release. But in my opinion, the current core gameplay is smooth and extremely fun. I'm definitely looking forward to playing it again in the future. Mecha BREAK is not a direct replacement for Gundam Evolution, but for me, it will probably fill in the gap left by GeVo's passing. I believe both games could have coexisted with one another, as the games differ enough to give different play experiences and require different tactics, but at the same time have similar core mechanics to allow you to go from one game to the other. The biggest difference for me is that you can switch between the different game modes in Mecha BREAK, whereas in GeVo you just hope you don't get Buried City. And as a former Ashmar main, I'm just glad I won't get two-shotted by Barbados anymore. Thanks for watching! Please let me know what you think in the comments!